Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about the best military allies to get in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. There's a whole bunch of factors at play over here. Specifically, major factions, basically legendary lord factions, are much better than minor factions. Certain races are better than other races, and of course it depends on who you're playing as. Because if you have a high level of aversion, or a certain race has a high level of an aversion towards you, chances are you're not going to have a successful military alliance. So that is important, having allies that you can actually get along with, being a fairly significant factor, as well as those allies having powerful armies, powerful lords, and also not starting any new wars or having wars declared on them because of aversion. Of course, it's all complicated, depends on the map situation. Basically, you could take every single legendary lord apart and talk about who are the most useful allies for that particular legendary lord. This is a broader discussion focused on races. Now, originally I wanted to include vassals as well here, but the more I thought about it, and as people pointed out to me, you want different things from military allies than you want from vassals. With military allies, you do want them to have a powerful military, to be able to expand territory, to be able to take territory without you babysitting them, or for them to be able to defend territory. And also the aversion factor being significant. And also how their AI is scripted, because different races are going to behave differently. Some races are very aggressive on the campaign map, others are not so aggressive, they're more passive, and those can actually make for some very useful allies if you're playing defense. On the offense, there's some better factions for that, but usually speaking, you don't necessarily want a military ally that's going to be an aggressive conqueror, because that's going to land you in a lot of wars, especially if the faction, the race they're part of, isn't necessarily capable of winning those wars. Think of the Beastmen as an example, the Greenskins, with the notable exception of like Grimgore. Those can be poor military allies, and also just the ability of expanding territory and holding territory. Like the Wood Elves are actually really poor really poor military allies in a campaign, because they won't expand the territory, they don't care about it, they don't need it, they'll even trade it to you at a fairly good rate. If you are one of their military allies, they might even give you some settlements for free, but they're not going to help you from a military perspective. And while some of their units are great, there are certainly some better options. I would say artillery and some big entities are really powerful units when it comes to recruitment. I'll talk about vassals in a separate video, but let's start with military allies. At number 5, we of course begin with the Lizardmen. The Lizardmen are a fairly decent faction, though they're certainly not one of the best. They're, you could say, middle of the road in terms of faction strength. They have strength, but they also have weaknesses, and they may be lacking in certain areas. Lore choices are not particularly great. Heroes are pretty good, though, but capacity of increasing heroes can be difficult. The thing about Lizardmen is that their units, the Saurus in particular, but also the dinosaurs, can do very well in auto-resolve because they have high leadership and a pretty good amount of armor, which does count when it comes to auto-resolve. Their economy is also decent, and they can get quite a lot, especially in long campaigns. The best Lizardmen legendary lord to have as an ally is Lord Mazdamundi. That's because Mazdamundi starts a war with two minor factions, and he'll eventually end up at war with the Imperial factions and the Blue Vipers, but he can defeat all of them. The only situation where when I see Mazdamundi losing this fight is because Morathi decided to come down from the north to swallow him up. Morathi is the only one actually surrounding him that can defeat him. So basically, if you're playing Morathi or any other faction that's close enough to Mazdamundi, you can get a really powerful military ally that, although he's limited by the geographic position, it's always important to have a direct land link between your military ally and the territory you want him to help you in. Although that's certainly a limiting factor with Mazdamundi, he will become one of the most powerful factions on the campaign map, like past turn 50. It isn't uncommon to see Mazdamundi at a very high strength ranking, especially if you're helping him out with some of his territories, because then he gets a huge swath of territory, some good provinces that do give him a lot of potential in his campaign, and he can be pretty useful. Limited by the sea lanes, but pretty powerful. And Lizardmen, with their Saurus armies, when they show up on the battlefield, are pretty great. And when it comes to allied recruitment options, the Lizardmen do obviously offer you the dinosaurs with their melee combat ability, or their range combat ability, or their abilities in general, as well as, of course, some other units. So pretty good to have them as allies. They do add value with their outposts and whatever settlement they decide to build that outpost in. So there's a good amount of value from having a Lizardmen ally if you can get them. They also don't necessarily have a high level of aversion with many factions, with the exception of the chaotic factions, like the Norskins, for instance, or the demonic faction. So basically with most factions around the world, yes, there is a level of aversion, especially with Mazdamundi, with that -10 diplomatic relations, but it's not the kind of level of aversion between the Lizardmen and other factions that makes it so you can't maintain a grand coalition with them. You can do some pretty ridiculous things with Lizardmen allies in a campaign. I mean, one Morathi campaign, I ended up allying Chaos, the Empire, and Mazdamundi. Was a really weird alliance, but it actually works really well for Morathi. Or if you're playing the High Elves, of course, you can also ally Mazdamundi and he'll protect this entire area, prevent any faction from coming from down here up to you. If you're on the other side of the campaign map, Krokkar can be useful on this whole side or the entire south if you're talking about him. That said, it does depend a lot on the legendary lord. So Mazdamundi, Gorok, and Krokkar, very useful as allies. The Cult of Sotik and Oxyatl and Tic-Tac-Toe to a more limited extent, not necessarily so great. Especially Tic-Tac-Toe, he's a really aggressive expansionist in his campaign area. He most of the time declares war on a lot of these factions over here. It's a bit weird because Tic-Tac-Toe might as well be a warrior of chaos, or greenskin legendary lord given his aggressiveness. But for the most part, the Lizardmen aren't aggressive expansionists. And that's great if you want a really good defensive ally to help you out in your campaign when you need them to. With a pretty good army that can stand up to a lot, win quite a few battles because of the benefits they have in auto-resolve, as well as the magic that they do have in their campaigns. Or we have the Tomb Kings. Now, the Tomb Kings are not going to give you a lot of money from engaging in diplomacy with them, not from trading settlements or anything like that, though they can be pretty decent trading partners. Here's the thing about the Tomb Kings. They have pretty powerful armies that are disposable. The lords are all immortal, so you kill a lord of the Tomb Kings, he's going to be coming back for you. But the heroes can die. The armies can be replenished as long as they have the structures for 0 money. And this is actually a significant aspect with the Tomb Kings. Their income might be one of the lowest in the game, but they don't really need income for anything except buildings, and they'll certainly have enough income to get those buildings, especially if you're giving them money. So the Tomb Kings can start pumping out really powerful armies in the campaign, provided you support them, give them money, give them resources, give them territory from which they can get buildings. That makes them incredibly useful to have as allies, because one of the problems a lot of factions have, a lot of races have in the game, is being useful allies because their economy is limited. Well, the Tomb Kings, their economy is limited, but it also doesn't matter as much for them. As long as they can get the unit capacity for structures, they're going to get powerful armies every single time. And while all of them, with the exception of Archon, start only with 1 army, eventually they'll start getting more armies. A second one at turn 15, a third one at turn 32 or so. Basically, the more you play the campaign, the more useful these guys get, because you start seeing full armies, full stacks. Even if they're just filled with skeletal warriors and skeletal spearmen, they're quite capable of holding their own. And that's not even counting the really powerful units that the Tomb Kings do have. They have pretty good artillery, they have pretty good range units with the Shopties, in terms of like pure entities, monsters units. And then single entities, really good single entities as well. So the Tomb Kings can be exceptionally useful as a military ally, because they're so hard to conquer for other AI factions. Like, I've seen Archon the Black over here, who starts over here in the west, like just hold his own against numerous factions in the campaign on Legendary very hard and be able to survive. He didn't necessarily expand. But basically, the Tomb Kings make for great military allies, because if you give them some territory, they'll hold it pretty well. They'll be great defensive allies. They'll also be good conquerors as long as you give them the resources to succeed in that. And they'll also give you significant benefits to your own armies in terms of either artillery or monstrous units or single entity units, giving you a significant amount of power they can gain through that military alliance with them. And those units, by the way, those units that the Tomb Kings have don't cost upkeep. Pretty sure that if you recruit for allied recruitment, could be wrong on this, but if you get for allied recruitment, I don't really engage in the system as much, because paying for units that you're not getting the skill upgrades is not worth it. But with the Tomb Kings, their units don't cost money, you just need the capacity for them. It's limited, of course, if you're allied to Tomb Kings. But having a bunch of Tomb King allies, the way I division the Tomb Kings is either you make an alliance with one single faction and give them a lot of territory, or you make an alliance with multiple factions, and then you start getting into a bit ridiculous situations where, let's say you have 3 Tomb King allies around the map. Like over here, if you're playing as Forik, you can get 3 Tomb King allies, because you can get the Tomb Kings and the dynasty over here that hold the cracked land, you can get Khalida, you can get etc. It's a bit difficult, but it is possible. And you don't need the territory yourself. Well, each of those will have 3 full armies that they're going to throw at the enemy past turn 30. That gives them a lot of power, individually and working collectively. Or you can take the approach of giving one single Tomb King, like Cetra, a lot of territory, and then watching Cetra produce Doom stacks that he'll always afford as long as he gets the buildings for it. So there is a ridiculous amount of power when you're talking about the Tomb Kings from a military, from an allied military perspective. Though it is better to have multiple allies, because that way you can get more units, more powerful units, going over, of course, the capacity, the unit capacity that the military system does have, because it's based on each faction, right? It would be great to be able to increase that capacity. That would actually make them even more useful allies than they are, especially if you're just allying one particular Tomb King. Like if you're playing as Forik, chances are you're likely going to ally Khalida as an example. Makes sense. Makes sense in a lot of ways in Forik's campaign. It can work very well. So, powerful military allies can hold the flank, can defend territory, can expand territory, won't give you a lot of money, but do have a lot of power from a military perspective. Horrible vassals, though. Worth pointing that out. Horrible vassals, because you're barely going to gain anything economically from them. Their economy just doesn't generate a lot of money because they're lacking the background income. Now, number 3, we of course have the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves do have quite a lot of substantial benefits in their campaigns on higher difficulties. And this is actually something that makes them really, really good vassals, because they'll generate a huge amount of income. Let me explain how this goes. The Dark Elf economy is powered by slaves, but AI doesn't really care about the slave cost of maintaining that economy, so they can generate a ridiculous sum of money. Like the base economic structure, if you have slaves, generate 300. This is one of the highest in the game, with the exception of like Black Fortresses and Wood Elf forests. At the highest level, they're generating 700 base income. You add in the modifiers in terms of upkeep and income that AI has, and the Dark Elves do have a ridiculous amount of money, which makes them incredibly useful as military allies, especially if you're a disorder faction, so like Warriors of Chaos or Greenskins. They can be exceptional allies because they are more... they lean towards disorder, though they're not quite fully there. You can ally them as factions of order, though if you're playing a faction of order, you're probably better off with other factions of order. That's one thing that's worth pointing out. But if you're a disorder faction, the Dark Elves are insane, because they are insane on higher difficulties, especially Hellebron over here or Morathi. The reason Hellebron is so substantial, look at her starting province. It's got 4 settlements, then she's got another one over here, where she's likely at least going to take some territory of it because she's at war with that faction. Then she might end up taking all of Grand if she ends up at war with Valkia, which may happen more often than not. So you're looking at a vassal where if they have a good amount of territory, they're going to generate ridiculous sums of money. Not necessarily so great if they have very little territory, but if they have a decent amount of territory, they're incredibly powerful. They'll crank up a lot of armies, and those armies are pretty damn terrifying. Because even their baseline dread spears are pretty solid in a battle as a shield wall. Not as good as the High Elven spearmen, but still pretty effective. But then you look into the Dark Shards, especially the Dark Shards with shields that they can recruit at tier 2. So you can imagine, if you're playing against the Dark Elf, or if you have a Dark Elf as a military ally, they'll be producing quite a lot of Dark Shards. Then they have a great amount of hero capacity between Masters, K-Knight Assassins, Death Hags, and of course Sorceresses, which means they'll bring magic, melee combat ability, replenishment to the table as well. They also have some really good units in their roster that you can use in allied recruitment. Like Blackheart Corsairs are really good tier 3 units, Dragons are really good at a high level, Hydras are pretty solid as well when it comes to a roster. Shades are also pretty damn good, though the difference between Shades and Dark Shards is that Shades are more of a sneaky type of range unit, whereas Dark Shards are a straight up frontline range unit that can soak a lot of range damage because they have those silver shields. So a great deal of power in their armies, a great deal of power with their legendary lords, a great deal of power of economy, and all of those factors combined make them very useful allies. Because the AI also avoids the pitfalls that the Dark Elves do have. Their armies can be pretty expensive. Well, when you have upkeep benefits and income benefits, that doesn't matter. If you've played the campaign as a Leaf-Anar, then you know what it's like to face off against Hellebron or Malekith, because once they get a lot of territory, they'll crank up multiple stacks of troops, and it can be difficult even as a Leaf-Anar dealing with that or defending against that. But those same things make them really, really useful allies to have on the campaign map. Specifically Hellebron and Morathi, though Lokir can be pretty good. Lokir can be pretty good. Malekith can be pretty good. Even Karf can be pretty solid as well as a military ally. Another thing that they have in terms of benefits as a race is that a lot of their legendary lords start in positions where they're kind of isolated from faction. So one of the tricks to use when you're trying to ally a faction and making them useful is selling them territory down a particular path so that they'll start conquering in that path. So for instance, if I'm allying Hellebron, well, I kind of want to give her territory all the way here. If I'm not playing Valkia, for instance, I want to give her territory here, because she'll then start expanding in this direction, and she'll do a pretty good job. Or I want to give her territory over here, or even in Ulfwan, and she'll do an amazing job with that. Of course, it is a bit tricky when it comes to crossing sea lanes. The AI is not especially good at that, some restrictions on territory, but still, Dark Elves do have powerful armies, do have a lot of power, and their AI avoids the shortcomings that the Dark Elves do have, because Dark Elves are a pretty powerful race. A lot of people don't like them because of their mechanics, but those limitations, obviously dimension them if you're playing, though you can overcome them and get a ridiculous amount of power with the Dark Elves, but the AI doesn't have those limitations in terms of economy, in terms of control, so that makes them incredibly strong on the campaign map as a race in general. Every Dark Elven faction, with the exception of Malice Darkblade, who just starts surrounded by enemies, generally accomplishes quite a lot on their campaign situation. Lokir can struggle against the might of Cathay assembling against him, but that isn't necessarily given. I've seen it both ways. Most of the time, Cathay wins in a long fight on Legendary very hard, but Lokir certainly gives it as good as he gets. But Karf, he's actually the last man standing over here in Lustria in a lot of campaigns, and he generally takes on the full might of Lustria and survives for a fairly decent amount of time just because of the ridiculous benefits the Dark Elves have. And let's not even talk about Malekith or Morathi and how they stand up in a longer campaign or in a campaign in general. So, useful allies, good armies, good allied recruitment options, an aggressive expansionist AI, but they're not so aggressive and they don't hate factions so much that it becomes a major headache, unlike, say, the Greenskins or Demons or Beastmen, because those do have significant downsides if you have them as allies. The Dark Elves won't drag you in as many wars as those factions will, as those races will, but they might drag you in certain wars against certain factions that they do heavily dislike, like the High Elves, for instance. They do dislike the Order factions in general. At number 2, we have the Dwarves. What makes the Dwarves so powerful when controlled by the AI, and what makes them so good as military allies? Well, let's look at the Dwarves. They're one of the weakest races in the game when you're controlling them, but AI basically vastly improves them. What are the issues? Weaker economy, then the cost of the armies that they have, because their armies can be pretty expensive and they don't have an economy like Dark Elves or some other races to support large armies. No problem for the AI. Economic benefits, upkeep benefits. Growth. Really poor growth for the Dwarves. The AI doesn't care because the AI has much better growth. Good control, so you're overcoming the grudge meter. The hell, they don't even bother with the grudge meter when they're controlled by the AI. And then good casualty replenishment, which is also another issue for the Dwarves. You take, basically, the Dwarven AI on Legendary removes a lot of the downsides of the Dwarves and keeps all the benefits. The benefits being that they have ridiculously powerful hero options. They have pretty good Legendary Lords, or some of them are really, really good. Forik Ironbrow is insane to deal with in a battle because he's a runesmith. He has a lot of combat ability. He'll win against your army on your own as Scarbrand. It's a bit insane how durable this guy is. And the thing is, the Dwarves have some of the most significant benefits when it comes to the AI situation. See, in an AI on AI situation, what really matters is armor and leadership in terms of Atrazov. Well, guess what the Dwarves have on every single unit with the exception like Slayers and Rangers? Very high leadership, very high armor on virtually all of their units, with the exception of Slayers, who still have incredible leadership and are breakable, and so will do pretty good and not resolve all the same. Rangers less so, but still a good amount of benefits over there. Really powerful artillery, just high value armies, individual armies that count for a lot in individual battles. Weak race to play, but incredibly good as allies, because the AI benefits on higher difficulties do really benefit the Dwarves to a significant extent. It took making the Greenskins one of the most overpowered races in the game to play in under AI control, though the Greenskins are not great military allies because they have a lot of aversion from a lot of factions. They're also very aggressive, so they'll start a bunch of a lot of pointless wars. The Dwarves are more passive, more defensive oriented, though if they're fighting an offensive war, you'd be surprised how effective these guys can be. And of all of them, Fork-Ironbrow is actually the most powerful, though Belegar is pretty good in his own right, and Ungrim, who is actually the worst Dwarf Legendary Lord to play, is also very substantial. I've played multiple campaigns as Kislev where I just gave Ungrim a direct line between his core territory and Norska, and he ended up conquering Norska, or vast portions of it. Any AI faction that can do that on their own, something that even the Warriors of Chaos can struggle, by the way, like Azazel, you think he's going to conquer all of Norska? Yeah, he's not going to do so very easily. Any AI faction that can do so has a ridiculous amount of power in the hands of the AI. The problem of the Dwarves is limited territory that they have, so if you help them out with territory, they become pretty damn ridiculous in their campaigns and give you a lot of value. Like, you can rely even on a minor dwarf faction to hold a flank, let alone a major dwarf faction who you can leave to just handle the entire area of the campaign map and never bother with it again for the rest of your campaign. Like, if you're playing as the Empire or Kislev, this is a fairly significant affair, especially as Kislev, because as Kislev you want to expand in the Empire, but you don't want to leave your northern flank undefended. Well, just give territory to the Dwarves. Karakadrak at first, Ungrim later on, and they'll hold the entire northern flank for you, so you don't have to play the defensive campaign. You can play the offensive campaign and actually take territory that's good as Kislev. That's just an idea. And this applies, of course, to any legendary lord that has some dwarves next to him. Like, Arkhan can vassalize these dwarves over here, and they also make great vassals. Not necessarily the best income, but in terms of like military value as vassals, they are pretty damn incredible. From minor factions to major factions, they're one of the few factions where even a minor faction makes a great ally, because even a minor dwarven faction will still produce an entire stack of dwarf warriors. High leadership, high armor, they can defeat many armies on their own. So they're really powerful for both minor and major factions, and if you give them a good amount of territory, watch them steamroll out of control. They might actually surpass your empire if you help them out to a certain extent. And that is a bit ridiculous when you're looking at the dwarf situations. Just really good armies, good unit recruitment options as well as an ally, because obviously their artillery is really good, some of their infantry units are really good as well. Iron Breakers being really good infantry units, Quarrelers being great, Rangers being pretty decent, though you're not really going to get the full benefit of Rangers unless you have a Fane hero yourself. But still, plenty of options when it comes to allied recruitment that you can benefit from, in particular artillery being really good. Tier 2 artillery especially, because the Grudge Throwers are pretty good artillery overall in the game, and they can be recruited at Tier 2, so that means they're going to be available fairly quickly in terms of allied recruitment. Not necessarily the best economy, but a lot of benefits in terms of having a bunch of dwarf allies in your campaign. And number one, we have the High Elves. What's there not to like about the High Elves? They have a roster of very powerful legendary lords, which in itself is very substantial. They have very cost-effective armies and good armies in terms of their spearmen and archers being the backbone of all their armies. Not the best armies in the game, but still pretty effective. And if you've ever fought a war against Ulfon, you know how every single legendary lord here can produce 2 free stacks on their own. And it doesn't matter how good your units are, when you're facing 3 stacks of spearmen and archers, that is a very substantial problem on your hands. They also have really good settlements when it comes to the defense, especially if the battles are fought manually. Of course, that's less relevant for the AI, but the defensive benefits that the elves get, very substantial, pretty good economy, reliant on trade, so they make great trading partners. Of course, they're kind of fleecing you when it comes to the fact that they're selling you a lot of their elven trinkets, but still, they get the good economy, you trade with them, their economy improves, you both benefit from that particular situation. Good hero choices, good lore choices. There's a lot of things to like about the elves when it comes to just playing them, let alone for them to be military allies. Lots of power in their campaign, lots of potential in their campaign, really good unit roster throughout, not just early game, because later on, you know, you start talking about things like Sisters of Avalorn, you start talking about some of their dragons, Phoenix Guard. You do start seeing a lot of power from the High Elves. Like, they've got a very versatile roster of units, so you can't really go wrong, and the AI certainly will recruit a bunch of units. You can't really go wrong when it comes to unit recruitment for the High Elves, unless you're recruiting Great Eagles, which the AI inexplicably does sometimes, or more often than they should, really. And they have some kind of weird build orders, but they are really good military allies. They give you good allied recruitment. They're fairly reliable allies. They don't have a huge aversion with a lot of races. They have major diplomatic benefits with all factions because of their handmaidens. So they're not going to get you involved in a bunch of pointless wars that you don't want. If you have a military alliance with the High Elves, you're kind of the one driving the aggression over there in the campaign, and you can generally rely on the High Elves to have your back in your wars or to help you guard a flank. Those are the benefits with the High Elves. It's pretty straightforward when it comes to it. Just great everything, pretty much. The Dark Elves have the problem in the sense that quite a few factions can hate them. No one really hates the High Elves unless we're talking about demonic factions. Unless we're talking about the demonic factions and Dark Elves. So a lot of the factions on the world, like Lizardmen, for instance, they're not going to hate them. Bretonia, Empire, etc. So you can really make these alliances work with them and gain a lot of value through allying the High Elves in your campaign. And just a ridiculous amount of power. And that's not even the fact that they may get the Sword of Cain. Alariel, most of the time, will get the Sword of Cain. Imagine having the Sword of Cain show up to back you up in a battle. Well, that can happen if you ally the High Elves in your campaign. They hate the Order faction, so vampires are going to be hated, Skaven, of course. But as an Order faction, they will get along with you, and they'll get along well with other Order factions as well. And that's it. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.